man was buried alive in Cordoba, and the only person who knew the truth was forbidden by his own conscience to speak of it for 30 years. This is Mubarak, and tonight I am going to tell you what happened in the golden courtyards of Islamic Spain, when the call to prayer echoed over orange trees and fountains, and when, behind closed doors, some of the gentlest-looking men in the city carried secrets heavy enough to crush a soul. Settle into your bed, let your shoulders drop, and let your breathing slow, because where we are going tonight, you will want to be very still and very quiet, the way you would if you were actually standing in the shadow of those old stone arches, listening. It begins on a warm spring night in the city of Cordoba, in the years when the Umayyad Caliphate ruled over Al-Andalus, and the city was said to have more books than any city in the world, except perhaps Baghdad itself. The streets smelled of jasmine and wet limestone, because it had rained earlier that evening, just enough to settle the dust without turning the roads to mud. A merchant named Yusuf ibn Hakam was walking home from the central market, a leather satchel under his arm, his sandals tapping softly against the cobblestones. He was not a wealthy man, not yet, but he was respected, known for his honesty in a trade where honesty was rare, the buying and selling of dyed silk brought up from the ports near Almeria. He had just closed a deal that would, if it held, change his family's fortunes for a generation, and his mind was full of plans. A new roof for his mother's house, a dowry saved for his sister, perhaps even a small library of his own, because in Cordoba, even modest men dreamed of owning books. He turned down a narrow street he had walked 1,000 times, a street so familiar he could have walked it blind, lined with whitewashed walls and wooden doors painted the color of pomegranates. But that night, something was wrong. The street was utterly silent. No dogs barked, no shutters creaked. Even the fountain at the end of the lane, which always trickled with a sound like a quiet conversation, was still. Yusuf paused, feeling the hair rise on his arms, and told himself it was nothing, that the rain had simply driven everyone indoors early. He kept walking, and that was when he saw the door. It was the door to a house he had never noticed before, though he had passed this street more times than he could count. The door was old, far older than the buildings around it, made of a dark wood that did not match the pale stone walls, with iron studs arranged in a pattern that looked, if you squinted, almost like an eye. The door stood slightly ajar, and from the gap came a faint golden light, flickering like candle flame, and a smell that was not quite incense and not quite anything Yusuf had ever known, something sweet and faintly rotten underneath, like flowers left too long in standing water. He should have walked on. Every instinct in his body told him to walk on, but Yusuf was a man who had grown rich, relatively speaking, by being curious about closed doors that other men avoided, by asking the questions other merchants were too proud or too frightened to ask. So he stepped closer. He heard a voice from inside, low and rhythmic, almost like recitation, but the words were wrong, twisted. Not the Arabic he had grown up praying in, not anything he recognized at all. A chill went through him that had nothing to do with the night air. He should have run. Instead, he pushed the door open another few inches and looked inside. What he saw, he would never fully explain to anyone for the rest of his life. Not even to the Qadi who eventually summoned him to testify, not even to his own wife on the nights she woke beside him to find him sitting upright in the dark, staring at nothing. He saw a room lit by dozens of small clay lamps arranged in a circle on the floor, and within that circle, a man kneeling, his back to the door, his shoulders shaking as though he were either weeping or laughing. It was impossible to tell which. And on the wall behind him, painted in something dark that Yusuf prayed was only dye, was a series of symbols that made his stomach twist, symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when he was not looking directly at them. Yusuf stepped back so quickly he nearly fell, and in doing so, his satchel knocked against the doorframe with a loud, hollow thud. The kneeling man went still. Then, slowly, impossibly slowly, he began to turn his head. Yusuf did not wait to see the man's face. He ran, faster than he had run since he was a boy racing other children through the orchards outside the city walls, his sandals slapping against wet stone, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He did not stop running until he reached the main square, where the lamps of the night watch still burned, and a few late vendors were packing up their stalls, and only then did he allow himself to stop, bent double, gasping, his satchel clutched to his chest like a shield. He told no one that night. He told no one for 3 days. He convinced himself, the way frightened men often do, that he had imagined it, that the wine he'd shared with the silk dealer had been stronger than he realized, that shadows and fear had conspired to turn an ordinary scene into something monstrous. But on the 4th day, a neighbor mentioned, almost in passing, that a man 2 streets over had gone missing, a quiet bookbinder named Khalid who lived alone and kept odd hours. No one had seen him in nearly a week, and the street where he lived, the neighbor said, shaking her head, was the same narrow lane with the fountain that never seemed to flow quite right. Yusuf felt the blood drain from his face. He went that very afternoon in broad daylight with 2 of his cousins for company, determined to find the door again, determined to prove to himself that what he had seen was nothing more than a trick of shadow and fear. But the door was not there. In its place stood a perfectly ordinary wall, the same pale whitewashed stone as the rest of the street, without seam or crack to suggest a door had ever existed. His cousins exchanged glances, the kind of glances people share when they are trying to decide whether to be worried about a friend's sanity. Yusuf insisted, ran his hands over the stone, searched for hinges, for hidden seams, for anything. He found nothing. The wall was simply a wall. It would have ended there, perhaps filed away as the strange imagining of a tired man, except that 2 weeks later, Khalid the bookbinder was found. He was alive, which was its own kind of horror, because the state in which he was found made everyone who saw him wish, in their secret hearts, that he had not been. He was discovered wandering near the riverbank at dawn by a fisherman casting his nets, dressed in the same clothes he had disappeared in, now filthy and torn, his hair grown long and matted as though weeks had passed rather than days, though by every calendar reckoning it had been precisely 14 days. He could not, or would not, speak of where he had been. When people asked him directly, his eyes would go distant, fixed on some point past their shoulder, and his hands would begin to tremble until someone changed the subject. The only thing Khalid ever said about it to anyone was spoken to the imam of his local mosque, in a confession given so quietly that the imam himself debated for years whether he had a religious obligation to share it. He said that he had followed a voice he believed, in his confusion, to be the voice of a friend calling to him for help, down a street he did not recognize, through a door that should not have existed, into a room where time did not move the way it should, where he sat across from something that wore a man's shape the way a puppet wears clothes, something that asked him questions about his faith, about whether he truly believed what he recited 5 times a day, or whether the words had become empty habit, mere sound without meaning. And every time Khalid answered honestly, truly searching his own heart for the truth, the room grew brighter, and the thing across from him grew smaller, more pitiful, more like smoke struggling to hold its shape. And every time fear made him answer with the easy, comfortable lie, the thing grew larger, and the lamps guttered, and the air grew cold enough to ache in his lungs. He said it felt less like an interrogation and more like a kind of test that he had been taking, without knowing it, his entire life, and that the room had simply made the test visible, made him face, in physical form, the exact measure of sincerity in his own heart. The imam, hearing this, thought of the verses about the soul knowing its own deeds, about nothing in a person's heart being hidden from the one who created that heart. He did not know what to make of the door, or the room, or the thing that wore a man's shape, but he understood, sitting across from Khalid, that this was not a story told for attention or sympathy. This was a man trying, with great difficulty, to explain something his own mind had not finished processing. Khalid never fully recovered his old life. He gave up bookbinding within the year and instead devoted himself to memorizing the Quran with an intensity that surprised everyone who had known him as a mild, distracted craftsman. He would tell anyone who asked, in later years, that he was not trying to earn forgiveness for anything in particular, but rather trying to make certain that if he was ever asked again, by anything, in any room, whether his faith was real, The answer would not require him to search his heart for it. The answer would simply be true, the way breathing is true, without effort, without performance. As for Yusuf, the silk merchant, he never spoke of what he had seen except to his eldest son, decades later, on the night before that son left Cordoba for his own journey east. He told the story exactly as I have told it to you, and he ended it the same way every time, with the same warning that the city holds doors that are not always there, that open only to those whose hearts are already wandering down dark corridors of doubt and self-deception, looking, even if they do not know it, for someone to ask them the question they are most afraid to answer honestly. The door does not create the doubt, Yusuf would say. It only reveals it. And then, more quietly, he would add that the safest thing a person can do, walking through any city, in any age, is to make sure that if such a door ever opened for them, they would have nothing to fear from what waited on the other side. That story traveled through Cordoba for years afterward, whispered in courtyards, repeated by mothers warning children not to wander narrow streets after dark, though the details shifted with each telling, the way old stories do, until almost no one agreed on exactly what street it had happened on, or exactly what year. But there is another story from that same city, from a different quarter entirely, that very few people ever spoke of at all, because the man at the center of it was too ashamed, for the rest of his life, to repeat it himself. His name was Abdul Rahman, though not the famous Abdul Rahman the city's history books remember, just an ordinary man, a tax collector's clerk who had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable, in a position that gave him just enough power over his neighbors to occasionally abuse it without consequence. He would round figures upward when recording payments, pocketing the difference in coins so small that no single victim ever noticed, but which, across hundreds of transactions over several years, had made him quietly, secretly wealthy, far wealthier than his modest clerk's salary could explain. He told himself, as such men always do, that it was a small thing, that everyone did it, that the people he overcharged would never miss a few coins they could not even count precisely. He told himself this so often that he had nearly come to believe it. One evening, working late in the tax office near the great mosque, alone except for the lamplight and the ledgers stacked around him like the walls of a small fortress, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside, slow and deliberate, the footsteps of someone who was in no hurry at all. He called out, asking who was there, and received no answer. The footsteps continued, pausing now and then, as though whoever walked them was reading the names painted on the doors of each office along the corridor. Abdul Rahman's office was the last one. He sat frozen, watching the gap beneath his door, watching for the shadow of feet to appear there. It appeared, and then it stopped. A voice spoke through the door, calm and pleasant, almost friendly, the kind of voice you might use with an old acquaintance. It asked him, by name, whether he had finished balancing the accounts for the quarter. Abdul Rahman, his throat dry, managed to say that he had. The voice asked whether the accounts were accurate. He said yes, though the word came out smaller than he intended. The voice was quiet for a long moment, and then it said, still pleasant, still calm, that it would be very interested to review those accounts itself, and that it would be along shortly to do so. Then the footsteps resumed, moving away down the corridor, growing fainter, until they stopped entirely, somewhere in a part of the building that, as far as Abdul Rahman knew, did not actually connect to any other room. He sat at his desk until dawn, too frightened to move, watching the door. No one came. When the first clerks began arriving for the morning shift, he asked them, as casually as he could manage, whether anyone had been in the building late the previous night, conducting an audit or inspection. They looked at him strangely and said no, that no audit was scheduled, that he was the only one who had stayed past sundown. He told himself it had been exhaustion, a trick of an overworked mind. The same kind of story Yusuf, the silk merchant, had told himself after his encounter with the strange door. But that night, lying awake beside his sleeping wife, he found himself doing something he had not done in years, recalculating, in his head, every overcharge, every padded fee, every coin he had skimmed from people who trusted him to record their payments honestly. The total, once he finally forced himself to add it all together, horrified him in a way the act itself, spread thin across years, had never managed to. The following week, he did something none of his colleagues understood. He began quietly returning money, small amounts at first, disguised as corrections or refunds, to specific households whose names he remembered clearly because he had cheated them more than once. He told no one why. When his wife asked why their household budget had suddenly tightened, he told her only that he wanted to live differently, and she, sensing something serious beneath the vague words, did not press him further. It took him nearly 2 years to return what he believed, by his own honest reckoning, that he owed, and during those 2 years, he never again heard the footsteps in the corridor, though he would sometimes wake in the night certain, for just a moment, that he had heard them, faint and distant, somewhere just beyond the edge of sleep. He never told anyone what he believed those footsteps to be, whether an angel sent as a warning, or his own conscience given a voice and a sound, or something else entirely that he had no name for and no desire to name. But he told his own children, much later, when they were old enough to understand, that there is no ledger so well hidden that it remains hidden forever, and that the wisest thing a person can do is to balance their own accounts honestly long before anyone, human or otherwise, comes asking to review them. Not far from the tax office, across the river where the water mills turned slowly through the night, there lived a young woman named Mariam, the daughter of a respected physician who had grown up surrounded by manuscripts on medicine and astronomy, far more educated than most women of her time were permitted to be, because her father believed knowledge itself was a form of worship and saw no reason his daughter should be excluded from it. Mariam was engaged to be married to a scholar named Hamza, a kind and serious young man who taught at one of the smaller schools attached to the great mosque, and their wedding was planned for the autumn, when the heat of summer had finally broken and the city's courtyards filled again with the scent of ripening pomegranates. Everyone who knew them agreed it was a good match, two thoughtful, gentle people who seemed to understand each other without needing many words. 3 months before the wedding, Hamza fell ill with a fever that no remedy seemed to touch. Mariam's father, despite his skill, could do little but manage the symptoms and wait, and the household settled into the long, anxious rhythm of watching someone they loved suffer without being able to help. Mariam spent her days at Hamza's bedside, reading to him from books of poetry, holding cool cloths to his forehead, praying in the quiet hours when his breathing grew shallow and frightening. One night, exhausted past the point of rational thought, having not slept properly in nearly a week, she fell asleep in the chair beside his bed and dreamed, or believed she dreamed, of a garden she had never seen before, more vivid and detailed than any dream she could remember, full of trees bearing fruit she did not recognize, and a fountain whose water seemed to glow faintly silver in moonlight that came from no visible moon. In the dream, an old woman sat beside the fountain, her face kind but unreadable, and she told Mariam, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere in the garden at once, that Hamza's fever was not an ordinary illness, that it had been sent, or perhaps simply allowed, as a test not of his faith, but of hers, and that the outcome of the test would be decided not by any medicine her father could provide, but by what Mariam chose to do in the privacy of her own heart during the long, dark hours when no one else was watching. The old woman did not explain further. She simply pointed toward a path leading deeper into the garden, lined with roses so dark red they looked almost black in the strange silver light, and told Mariam that the path led to an answer, but that the answer would only be the right one if she found it through patience and trust, rather than desperation and bargaining. Then the dream dissolved, the way dreams do, and Mariam woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping upright in the chair, to find Hamza's breathing somehow steadier than it had been in days. She told no one about the dream, not even her father, because she could not explain why she felt it had been more than an ordinary dream, only that she did, with a certainty she had never felt about anything else in her life. Over the following weeks, as Hamza slowly, agonizingly slowly, began to recover, Mariam found herself changed by the dream in ways she struggled to articulate even to herself. She had always been a devout young woman, raised carefully in her faith, But she noticed now a difference between the prayers she had always said and the prayers she found herself saying in the quiet hours beside Hamza's sick bed. Prayers that asked for nothing specific, that simply rested in trust rather than demanding particular outcomes, the way the old woman in the garden seemed to have been gently teaching her to pray. She wondered, sometimes, lying awake long after Hamza had finally fallen into peaceful sleep, whether the garden had been a message meant specifically for her, a reminder that faith tested by suffering is not faith proven by getting the answer you wanted, but faith proven by how you carry yourself while you wait for any answer at all. Hamza recovered fully by midsummer, and they were married as planned, a little later than originally intended, in a ceremony that the whole street still spoke of years afterward for how genuinely joyful it felt, as though everyone present understood, even if they could not have said why, that something fragile and precious had nearly been lost and had instead, against the odds, been kept. Mariam never told Hamza about the garden either, not for many years, not until they were both much older and their own children were grown, and even then she told it carefully, almost shyly, as though she still was not entirely certain whether to call it a dream, or a mercy, or something else for which she had simply never found the right word. Across the city, in the quarter near the old Roman bridge, there was a very different kind of household, one that the neighbors spoke of carefully and at a respectful distance, because the man who lived there, a wealthy landowner named Saeed, had a reputation that made people uneasy in ways they could not always articulate. He was generous in public, donating freely to the mosque, funding the dowries of poor brides, feeding travelers who passed through the city with nowhere else to stay. But there were rumors, the kind that never quite solidify into anything provable, about how he treated the people who actually worked his lands, the laborers and tenant farmers whose names never appeared in any account of his generosity. It was said that he paid them late, or not at all, that he threatened to evict families from homes they had lived in for generations over debts that seemed to grow no matter how much was repaid, that more than one desperate father had come to his gate at night begging for mercy and been turned away by guards instructed never to let such men reach said directly. One autumn, a tenant farmer named Bilal, an old man who had worked Said's orchards since before Said himself was born, fell behind on payments after a season of poor rains destroyed most of his crop. He went to Said's house himself, against the advice of his own sons, who feared what the wealthy man's temper might do, and begged for patience, just one more season, just enough time to recover what the drought had taken. Said, standing in his beautifully tiled courtyard surrounded by the fountains and citrus trees his wealth had purchased, looked at the old man for a long moment and then laughed, not cruelly exactly, but with the careless dismissiveness of a man who had simply stopped seeing other people as fully real. He told Bilal that patience was a virtue for men who could afford it, and that he could not, and that if the debt was not paid in full by the new moon, the family would be removed from the land their grandfathers had farmed. Bilal walked home that evening through streets gone grey with twilight, and somewhere along the way, by the old aqueduct where few people walked after dark, he sat down on a low stone wall, too exhausted and too heartbroken to go any further, and wept the way men of his generation rarely allowed themselves to weep, openly, without shame, because there was no one left to perform strength for. And it was there, in that moment of complete and unguarded grief, that he became aware of someone sitting beside him on the wall, though he had heard no footsteps approach. He turned, startled, expecting perhaps a watchman come to move him along, but found instead a figure he could not quite focus his eyes on properly, neither old nor young, neither clearly man nor woman, dressed simply, who asked him, with what felt like genuine gentleness, why he wept. Bilal, too tired to be cautious, told the stranger everything: the failed harvest, the debt, Said's laughter, the threat hanging over his family's future. The stranger listened without interrupting, and when Bilal finished, simply said that every harvest fails eventually, for every person, in one way or another, and that the only true wealth anyone carries out of this world is the wealth of how they treated others while they had the power to help them, and chose not to. or the wealth of how they treated others when they had nothing themselves to give but kindness anyway. Then the stranger told him, very plainly, to go home and not worry further that night, that the new moon would bring a different outcome than he feared. Bilal turned to ask what the stranger meant and found the wall beside him empty, as though no one had ever sat there at all. He did not sleep that night, turning the strange encounter over and over in his mind, uncertain whether he had imagined it out of sheer exhaustion and grief. But 3 days later, word spread through the city that Said had been found in his own courtyard, alive but unable to move the left side of his body, struck in the night by an affliction the physicians could not explain or reverse, found by a servant only after he had lain helpless beside his own fountain for hours, calling weakly for help that did not come quickly enough to spare him the long, terrifying night alone with his own thoughts. In the months that followed, as Saad slowly relearned how to walk with a cane and how to speak without half his words slurring, something in him changed in ways that startled everyone who had known him before. He summoned Bilal personally, not to demand payment, but to forgive the debt entirely, and then, to the old farmer's complete astonishment, to forgive every debt owed to him by every tenant on his land, an act so far outside his previous character that some neighbors whispered he had been possessed by a different spirit entirely, while others, more thoughtfully, suggested that perhaps he had simply, finally, for the first time in his adult life, understood what it felt like to be powerless and dependent on someone else's mercy. Saad never spoke publicly about what had happened to him that night in his courtyard, what he had seen or felt in those long hours alone before help arrived. But Bilal, in his final years, would sometimes tell his grandchildren about the stranger by the aqueduct and about how he had come to believe, though he could never prove it to anyone's satisfaction, that mercy refused to one person has a way of returning, eventually, to find the person who refused it, in whatever form is necessary to finally make them understand. There was also the matter of the library. The one Cordoba was famous for across the entire known world, said to hold more volumes than the mind could comfortably imagine, copied and recopied by scribes who spent their entire lives bent over manuscripts, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have vanished from the earth entirely. A young scribe named Tariq worked there, a serious, quiet man who had dedicated himself to copying texts of medicine and philosophy with a precision that earned him the respect of scholars twice his age. He loved the library the way some men love a person, with a devotion that bordered on obsession, and he often stayed long after the other scribes had gone home, working by lamplight among the towering shelves, telling himself it was diligence, though in truth it was something closer to a refusal to be anywhere else. One night, deep in winter, when the cold made the stone halls of the library feel like the inside of a tomb, Tariq was copying a particularly difficult medical text when he heard, from somewhere deep in the stacks, the unmistakable sound of a page turning. He paused, listening. The library was supposed to be empty at this hour, the doors locked, the other scribes long gone home to their families. He told himself it was a draft disturbing loose papers and returned to his work. A few minutes later, he heard it again, closer this time, the soft, distinctive sound of someone carefully turning the page of a book, followed by what might have been a quiet, contemplative exhale. The sound a person makes when reading something that moves them. Tariq rose from his desk, lamp in hand, and walked toward the sound, his footsteps echoing strangely in the vast silence. He moved through aisle after aisle of shelves, the lamplight throwing huge, shifting shadows of the towering bookcases onto the ceiling, until he reached a small reading alcove near the back of the library, a space rarely used because the lamps there had never worked properly, and the light was always too dim for comfortable reading. And there, in that alcove, in light that should not have been sufficient to read by at all, sat a figure bent over an open manuscript, turning its pages slowly, deliberately, as though savoring each line. Tariq's first instinct was relief, the assumption that another scribe had simply stayed even later than himself, and he opened his mouth to greet whoever it was. But something about the stillness of the figure stopped him, an absolute, unnatural stillness, as though the person were not breathing between the slow exhales he had heard, as though the figure existed only in the brief moments it chose to make itself perceptible, and vanished into nothing in between. He raised his lamp higher, and the light caught the figure's face for just an instant, long enough for Tariq to see that the face was wrong in a way his mind refused to fully process. Features arranged correctly, but somehow without the subtle asymmetries and imperfections that make a face look genuinely human, like a face remembered rather than a face actually seen. The figure looked up at him then and spoke, in a voice that seemed to come from a great distance despite standing only a few feet away, and asked Tariq whether he understood what he was copying. Not the words themselves, which Tariq obviously understood as a skilled scribe, but the purpose behind them. The chain of human hands that had carried this particular piece of knowledge forward through centuries of fire and flood and conquest and forgetting, each link in that chain a person who had chosen, in their own small moment in history, to preserve rather than to let something valuable be lost. Tariq, his voice barely steady, said that he understood it was important work. The figure tilted its head slightly, an oddly bird-like gesture, and said that important was not quite the right word, that perhaps sacred was closer, and asked Tariq whether he treated his work as sacred or merely as a craft he happened to be skilled at. Tariq did not know how to answer honestly, because in that moment, standing in the cold, dark library with his lamp shaking slightly in his hand, he realized he had never actually asked himself that question before. He had always assumed his dedication to copying was itself a kind of answer. But dedication and reverence, he understood suddenly, were not always the same thing. The figure seemed to read this realization on his face, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed its strange, almost human features. It told him, before closing the manuscript and setting it carefully back on its shelf with a gentleness that contradicted everything unsettling about its appearance, that knowledge preserved without reverence eventually decays into mere information, useful perhaps, but lifeless, and that the scribes who truly mattered, across all the centuries this library represented, were not necessarily the most skilled, but the ones who approached each page as though it might be read, someday, by someone whose life would be changed by exactly those words. Then the figure was simply gone, not walking away, not fading, but gone in the way a held breath is gone the instant you finally exhale, as though it had never occupied space in the conventional sense at all. Tariq stood alone in the alcove for a long time before he found the will to move, and when he finally returned to his desk, he found that the manuscript he had been copying all evening, the one he had grown frustrated with for its dense, difficult passages, now read differently to him entirely, not because the words had changed, but because something in how he held them had. He never told anyone at the library what he had seen that night, partly from fear of being thought mad, and partly from a quieter instinct that the experience belonged to him alone and would lose something essential if spoken aloud too casually. But colleagues who worked alongside him in the following years noticed a change, subtle but real, in how he approached his copying, a new patience, a new care, as though every manuscript that passed beneath his pen had become something closer to a trust than a task. When he eventually trained his own apprentices, decades later, he told each of them, on their very first day, that they were not in the business of moving ink from one page to another, but in the business of carrying voices forward through time. Voices that would otherwise fall silent forever, and that this was not a metaphor, but the literal, sacred truth of what they had been chosen to do. Further toward the western edge of the city, where the wealthier homes gave way gradually to modest dwellings built against the old defensive walls, there lived a widow named Zainab, raising 3 children alone after her husband, a soldier, had died defending a border garrison 2 years before. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers quick and sure despite the long hours, and she managed, through relentless effort and careful budgeting, to keep her children fed and clothed, though there was rarely anything left over for comfort or pleasure. She prayed often, fervently, not for wealth, but simply for enough work, enough health, enough strength to see her children safely into adulthood. She was, by every account from those who knew her, a genuinely good woman, patient with her children, even when exhaustion made patience difficult, generous with what little she had toward neighbors who had even less. One winter, the coldest in years, her youngest child fell seriously ill, and the medicine the physician recommended cost more than Zainab could possibly afford after months of already stretched finances. She sat awake one night beside her son's small bed, watching him shiver despite the blankets piled over him, and she found herself praying with a desperation she had never quite allowed herself before. Not the calm, trusting prayers of her usual practice, but raw, pleading words, asking why. After everything she had endured already, this additional weight had been placed on her, asking whether her faith and her patience had counted for nothing at all. She fell asleep eventually, sitting upright against the wall beside her son's bed, and dreamed of walking through a market she did not recognize, where every stall sold not goods but moments, fragments of time visible like small glowing stones, and an old merchant behind one stall beckoned her closer and showed her, in his open palm, a particular stone glowing more brightly than the others. He told her this was a moment from her own future, several years ahead, a moment of her son, grown healthy and strong, sitting beside her in old age, reading to her from a book he had written himself. And the old merchant said that this future was real, was waiting, but that the road between this night and that future moment required her to keep walking forward, even through nights exactly like this one, when the path seemed cruelest and least fair. She woke at dawn to find her son's fever had broken sometime in the night, his breathing easy and steady for the first time in days. She never knew, and never tried too hard to determine, whether the dream had been a genuine mercy sent to comfort her, or simply her own exhausted mind manufacturing the hope she desperately needed to survive the night. But she chose, deliberately, to treat it as real, to let it strengthen rather than puzzle her, and in the years that followed, whenever hardship returned, as it inevitably did for a widow raising children alone in a city where fortune favored the already fortunate, she would think of that glowing stone in the old merchant's palm and find, somehow, the strength to keep walking the road toward it. Her son did grow healthy and strong, and did in fact, years later, become known throughout the city as a gifted writer. And on the evening he finished his very first completed manuscript, he read it aloud to his mother by lamplight, exactly as she had seen in her dream so many years before, though she never told him that, choosing instead simply to listen, tears in her eyes, grateful beyond words for a road that had, after all, led exactly where she had been promised it would. There was a story, too, about the great mosque itself, the one whose forest of red and white striped arches still stands today, though in those years it served a purpose its current visitors might struggle to picture, filled morning and night with the sound of prayer and recitation rising and falling like tides. A young muezzin named Ismail had recently been given the honor of calling the adhan from one of the smaller minarets, a position he had trained years for, practicing his voice daily until it carried clear and steady across the rooftops without wavering. He took the responsibility seriously, almost too seriously, his fellow students would tease, because he believed, with the earnest intensity particular to young men who have found their calling early, that every single call to prayer mattered, that somewhere in the city, every single time, there might be one person whose entire day, or whose entire life, turned on whether they heard those words spoken with sincerity or merely recited out of habit. One evening, climbing the narrow spiral stairs of the minaret for the sunset call, Ismail felt unusually heavy, exhausted from a difficult week, his mind cluttered with worries about his ailing father and a dispute with a friend that had left him distracted and unhappy. He told himself, climbing those stairs, that he would simply get through the call as he always did, competently, correctly, and then return home to deal with everything weighing on him. But as he reached the top of the minaret and looked out over the rooftops of Cordoba, gold and orange in the dying light, something in him resisted the idea of offering a merely competent call, a recitation performed rather than truly meant. He paused, breathing the cooling evening air, and made a quiet, private decision that this call, despite everything distracting him, would be one he gave with his whole heart, not for any audience, not even particularly for himself, but simply because the moment deserved nothing less. He began the adhan, and as the words left him, he felt something shift, a kind of clarity settling over his exhaustion and worry, his voice carrying further and steadier than he had ever managed before, rising over the city in the gathering dusk. When he finished and began his descent down the narrow stairs, he noticed an old man sitting at the base of the minaret, someone he did not recognize from the regular worshippers, dressed simply, watching him with an expression Ismail could not quite read, something between sorrow and deep gratitude. The old man told him, as Ismail passed, that he had been sitting at the base of that minaret every evening for the past month, unable to bring himself to enter the mosque, weighed down by a private grief he had told no one about, the death of his only son in an accident the year before, a grief he had begun, in his darkest moments, to mistake for evidence that his prayers had never truly mattered to anyone, that he had simply been speaking into silence his entire life. But tonight, hearing the call given with such evident sincerity, something in him had finally cracked open enough to let him walk through the mosque doors again for the first time in months. Ismail did not know what to say, humbled by the weight of what the old man had just told him, and simply helped him to his feet and walked beside him into the mosque, saying nothing further, understanding instinctively that the moment required presence rather than words. He never knew, in any way he could prove, whether his private decision on the minaret stairs had truly made any difference in how the call sounded to others, or whether the old man would have found his way back to prayer regardless that particular evening. But he chose, from that night forward, never again to offer a merely competent call, understanding now in a way he had only believed abstractly before that he genuinely never knew, each time he climbed those stairs, who exactly was listening, or what private battle his sincerity, or his lack of it, might tip in one direction or another. Across the river, in a small house that backed onto the old Roman walls, lived a man named Karim, who was, by his own admission and everyone else's, not a particularly devout person. He attended Friday prayers out of habit more than conviction, fasted during Ramadan more from social obligation than spiritual hunger, and privately, in the quiet of his own thoughts, harbored doubts he never voiced to anyone, uncertain whether the faith he had inherited from his parents was something he truly believed, or simply something he had never seriously questioned. He was a good neighbor, generally honest, kind to animals and children, but his relationship with his faith remained, throughout most of his adult life, a kind of polite distance rather than genuine engagement. His wife fell gravely ill one summer, a wasting sickness that no physician in the city could properly diagnose or treat, and Karim watched her grow weaker week by week with a helplessness that terrified him more than anything he had ever experienced. In his desperation, he began praying with an intensity entirely foreign to his usual habits, not from sudden faith, but from sheer animal desperation, the way a drowning man grasps at anything within reach. He found himself, late one night, kneeling on his prayer mat for the first time, in years, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely did not know what else to do with his terror and grief, and in that raw, unguarded state, he spoke aloud, almost angrily, demanding to know whether anyone was actually listening, whether his entire life of half-hearted, habitual faith had been speaking into a void this entire time. He fell asleep on the prayer mat that night, too exhausted to move to his bed, and woke sometime before dawn with a strange, vivid sense that he was not alone in the room, though when he opened his eyes, he saw nothing unusual, only his wife's still form on the bed and the grey pre-dawn light beginning to seep through the shutters. But he felt, with a certainty he could not explain or justify rationally, an overwhelming sense of having been heard, not answered yet, not promised anything, but heard. The way a person feels the difference between speaking to an empty room and speaking to someone who is genuinely listening even before they respond. The feeling was so powerful that he wept, kneeling there in the grey light, in a way he had not wept since childhood, and something in him that had been clenched tight for years, the polite distance, the habitual doubt, simply released. His wife did not recover immediately. In fact, her illness lingered for several more difficult months before slowly, gradually improving, with no clear turning point the physicians could identify or explain. But Karim's relationship with his faith had changed permanently that night, regardless of what happened to his wife's health, because he had discovered something he had never expected to discover, that genuine, desperate honesty before his creator produced a response entirely different from years of polite, habitual recitation, a response he could not describe in words that satisfied him, but which he never doubted again for the rest of his life. He became, in the years that followed, known throughout his neighborhood for a quiet, steady devotion entirely different from his earlier habitual practice. And when younger men asked him, as they sometimes did, how his faith had changed so dramatically, he would simply tell them that he had finally stopped being polite with God, and that everything had felt different ever since. There was one more story from that era, perhaps the strangest of all, concerning a young scholar named Faris, who had devoted his studies to astronomy. Spending countless nights on the rooftop of his family's home, charting the movements of stars and planets with instruments he had built himself, convinced that the precise, mathematical order of the heavens reflected something profound about the nature of the one who had created them. He was respected among his teachers for his intelligence, but also gently criticized for what some considered an excessive focus on calculation and measurement at the expense of contemplation, as though he were trying to reduce the majesty of creation to mere numbers on a page. One clear winter night, observing an unusual alignment of planets he had been tracking for months, Faris became so absorbed in his calculations that he lost all sense of time, working through the night by lamplight, cross-referencing his observations against tables compiled by astronomers generations before him. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he made a small error in his calculations, a simple mistake born of exhaustion, and looked up from his papers in frustration, rubbing his tired eyes, only to find that the sky above him looked different than it should have, the stars arranged in patterns that matched none of his careful records, as though he were looking at the heavens from some other point in time entirely, before recorded history, or perhaps long after it. He sat frozen on his rooftop, watching constellations he did not recognize wheel slowly overhead, and felt, for the first time in his career of careful, rational study, something his calculations had never quite given him, an overwhelming, wordless sense of his own smallness against the vastness of what he was studying. The strange sky lasted only a few minutes before gradually, almost gently, resolving back into the familiar patterns he had charted for years, leaving him uncertain whether he had witnessed something genuinely impossible or simply experienced a kind of waking dream, brought on by exhaustion and the strange, liminal hour just before dawn. But the experience changed how he approached his work permanently. He continued his precise calculations, continued building his instruments and recording his measurements, but he began also, for the first time, ending each night of observation with quiet, unhurried prayer, not because his teachers had finally convinced him that calculation alone was insufficient, but because he had glimpsed, even if only for a few strange minutes, the genuine scale of the mystery his numbers were only ever managing to sketch the barest outline of, and he found he no longer wanted to study the heavens without also, humbly, addressing the one who had set them spinning in the first place. Not every story from that city ended gently, and there is one that the old families of Cordoba rarely repeated in full, because the ending troubled even those who told it. There was a judge, a Qadi named Mansa, known throughout the city for his sharp mind and his reputation, hard-earned over many years, for absolute incorruptibility. Merchants and nobles alike feared bringing cases before him precisely because he could not be bribed, could not be flattered, could not be intimidated into a favorable ruling, no matter how powerful the person standing before his bench. People said, with a mixture of admiration and unease, that Mansa seemed to genuinely believe that justice mattered more than his own comfort, his own safety, even his own life, and in a city where wealth so often purchased mercy, this made him both beloved by the powerless and quietly resented by the powerful. A case came before him one summer that would test this reputation more severely than any before it. A wealthy landowner, a man with connections reaching into the governor's own household, stood accused of murdering a rival merchant over a disputed property boundary, the kind of case that, in most courts, would have been quietly dismissed or delayed indefinitely under pressure from above. The evidence against the landowner was strong, but not absolutely conclusive, built from witness testimony and circumstantial details, rather than anything that could not theoretically be explained away by a sufficiently clever defense. Mansur spent weeks examining every detail personally, questioning witnesses himself, rather than relying entirely on the accounts brought to him, refusing every quiet suggestion from intermediaries that perhaps this particular case deserved special handling given the families involved. 3 nights before he was due to deliver his ruling, Mansur received a visitor at his home, late, after his household had gone to sleep, a man he did not recognize who claimed to represent friends of the accused landowner, friends who wished to express, through this messenger, their hope that justice would be served fairly and without undue haste, accompanied by a chest of gold coins set quietly on the floor beside the messenger's feet, more wealth than Mansur had seen in one place in his entire career. Mansur, without raising his voice, without even appearing particularly angry, simply told the messenger that he would deliver his ruling on the appointed day, based entirely on the evidence presented in his court, and that the messenger should take both himself and the chest of gold out of his house immediately. The messenger left without further argument, but his parting words, spoken quietly at the door, carried a different tone entirely, a suggestion, never quite stated outright, that men who proved too inconvenient sometimes found their households visited by misfortune they could never afterward trace to any clear source. Mansur did not sleep well in the nights that followed, not from fear for himself. He had faced threats before in his years as a judge, and had grown a thick skin against them, but from worry for his family, his wife and his 2 young daughters, who had done nothing to deserve being caught in the consequences of his integrity. He prayed at length each night, asking not for the threat to disappear, but for the strength to do what was right regardless of what it might cost, and for protection over those he loved who had not chosen this dangerous path he walked. On the 2nd night, he dreamed, vividly and strangely, of standing in his own courtroom, but empty of all the usual officials and petitioners, populated instead by figures he sensed rather than clearly saw, standing silently along every wall, watching him with what felt like patient, attentive expectation, a voice seeming to come from the bench itself, the very seat where he delivered his own rulings each day, told him that every judge eventually sits as a defendant as well, that the measure he used for others would be the measure used for him, and asked him plainly whether he was prepared to be judged. Someday, by the same uncompromising standard he applied so rigorously to the cases before him, Mansur woke from this dream with a clarity he had not expected, and delivered his ruling exactly on schedule, finding the wealthy landowner guilty based on the evidence, with a thoroughness and precision in his written judgment that left no room for appeal on procedural grounds, closing every door the landowner's expensive lawyers might otherwise have used to escape the consequences. The landowner was sentenced according to the law, and though his family's influence eventually succeeded in having the sentence somewhat reduced through channels entirely outside Mansur's court, the conviction itself stood, a rare and significant victory for a murdered merchant's family who had never expected justice against someone so powerful. In the weeks that followed, nothing happened to Mansur's household, no misfortune, no retaliation, despite the veiled threat he had received. He went on serving as Qadi for another 15 years, building a reputation that outlasted him by generations, remembered long after his death as one of the few judges of that era whose rulings, people said, you could trust regardless of who stood accused before him. But Mansur himself, in private conversations with his closest friends late in his life, admitted that the dream he had on that second sleepless night had changed something fundamental in how he approached every single case afterward, that he no longer thought of himself merely as administering justice on behalf of the state, but as standing, every single day, in a courtroom of his own, before a judge whose standards made his own rigorous integrity look, by comparison, almost casual, and that this awareness, far from making him anxious or fearful in his work, gave him instead a strange, settled peace, the peace of a man who has stopped trying to please everyone around him and has instead committed entirely to pleasing the one whose judgment actually, ultimately matters. The final story from that golden city concerns not a single dramatic night, but a slow, quiet transformation that unfolded over many years. The kind of story that does not announce itself with strange doors or ghostly footsteps, but which the old people of Cordoba considered, in many ways, the most remarkable of all. There was a potter named Hassan, a man of unremarkable skill and unremarkable ambition, who spent his days at the wheel shaping ordinary vessels for ordinary households, never imagining himself capable of anything more significant than a steady living and a quiet life. He was a generous man in small ways, always willing to give a cracked but usable pot to a poor family rather than throw it away, always patient with the children who gathered to watch him work. But he carried, quietly, a private sadness that had shadowed him since youth, the loss of his only brother to illness when they were both still boys, a loss he had never fully processed and rarely spoke of to anyone. Hassan began, almost by accident, a habit that would define the rest of his life. After his brother's death, he found himself unable to throw away the broken pieces of pottery that resulted from failed attempts at the wheel, pots that cracked in the kiln or collapsed before they could be properly shaped, and instead of discarding them as waste, he began collecting the shards, eventually teaching himself a careful, painstaking technique for piecing broken vessels back together. Filling the cracks not with ordinary mortar, but with a mixture he developed himself that included traces of gold dust, so that the repaired pottery, rather than hiding its damage, displayed it openly, veins of gold tracing every place where the vessel had once been broken and made whole again. He could not have explained, even to himself, exactly why he began this practice, only that something in the work felt like it was answering a question he had never managed to put into words about his brother's death, about loss, about whether broken things could ever become not merely functional again, but actually more beautiful for having been broken and deliberately, carefully restored. Word of his repaired pottery spread slowly through the city, not because it was particularly valuable in monetary terms, but because something about the visible gold seams, the open acknowledgement of damage and repair rather than its concealment, resonated with people in ways Hassan never fully anticipated. Widows brought him broken family heirlooms, asking him to mend them. Parents whose children had accidentally shattered treasured pieces came to him, rather than simply replacing what was lost. And increasingly, people came to him not for the pottery at all, but simply to talk, sitting near his wheel as he worked, telling him about their own private griefs and failures and broken relationships, somehow comforted by watching him transform shattered ceramic into something whole and gold-veined and unashamed of its history. Hassan never became wealthy from his craft and never sought to, but in the final years of his long life, surrounded by a community of people he had quietly, gently helped through their own private sorrows simply by demonstrating, vessel after vessel, that breakage was not the end of a thing's usefulness or beauty. He came to understand something he tried, in his halting way, to pass on to his own apprentices before he died. He told them that every person carries cracks, places where life has broken something inside them that can never be made to look exactly as it did before, and that the question worth asking was never how to hide those cracks or pretend they had never happened, but how to fill them, patiently, deliberately, with something valuable enough that the breakage itself became part of what made a person, or a vessel, worth keeping. His own grief over his brother, he said, had never fully disappeared, even after 60 years, but it had become, through decades of careful, deliberate work, something he no longer needed to hide, a gold seam running through his own life that he had finally, slowly, learned to be grateful for rather than ashamed of. These are the stories that the old courtyards of Cordoba kept folded away in memory, long after the lamps were extinguished and the streets fell silent. Stories of doors that should not have existed, of footsteps that came for men with something to hide, of dreams that arrived exactly when they were needed most, of a judge who chose integrity over gold and slept peacefully because of it, and of a quiet potter who turned every broken thing he touched into something worth keeping. The city itself is still there, the arches still stand, The river still runs beneath the old Roman bridge, and somewhere in the quiet hours of the night, in cities far from Spain, in your own room right now, the same questions those people faced are still being asked of every one of us. Whether our faith is real or merely habit, whether we have settled debts we have been pretending not to remember, whether we are brave enough to choose what is right when no one else would ever know the difference. If you made it this far, listening in the dark, I would love to know in the comments which one of these stories disturbed you the most. The door that vanished into solid wall, the footsteps in the corridor, or something else entirely that stayed with you long after it ended. Because I read every single comment, and I am always curious which moments linger with you the longest after the lights go out. And if these stories kept you company tonight, kept you a little less alone in the quiet hours, share this video with a friend who loves true, eerie tales the way you do. Because the best stories, the ones that really stay with us, are always better when there is someone to talk about them with afterward. Close your eyes now. Let the events of today drift away, and let the quiet courtyards of old Cordoba carry you gently into a deep and peaceful sleep.